They said he should sit down and be quiet. They said he didn't belong there. But what happened when this 10-year-old black boy with a painful back injury raised his hand in a room full of Harvard mathematicians? This problem is impossible to solve, the arrogant professor proclaimed to the silent auditorium. No one dared to challenge him, until Marcus Johnson, standing alone at the back of the room, lifted his small hand into the air. "I'd like to try solving it," he said, his voice wavering but determined. What happened next left an entire university speechless and changed the course of countless lives. Could a child who couldn't even sit in class due to a teacher's abuse really solve what Harvard's finest called impossible? Dear viewer, if you are watching my story for the first time, I humbly request you write the location from where you are watching right now, subscribe this channel and press the bell icon now not to miss the notifications of my daily published new stories. Thank you, and let's dive into the full story. Marcus Johnson stood at the back of his 5th grade classroom, his fingers dancing across the pages of his notebook as he solved complex equations that Mrs. Taylor had written on the board. Unlike his classmates who sat in neat rows, Marcus preferred to stand, not out of defiance, but necessity. The dull ache in his lower back made sitting unbearable for more than a few minutes. "Marcus, would you like to take your seat?" Mrs. Taylor asked gently, noticing him shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I'm okay standing, Mrs. Taylor," Marcus replied quietly, his eyes never leaving his notebook. "I can see the board better this way." Mrs. Taylor nodded, understanding in her eyes. Unlike other teachers who had insisted he conform, she had accepted his explanation without pressing for details. She didn't know the full story, how Ms. Winters, his 4th grade teacher, had struck him with a ruler across his back when he'd corrected her mathematics error in front of the class. The injury had never properly healed. As Mrs. Taylor turned back to explain fractions to the class, Marcus had already moved on, solving calculus problems he'd found in a library book. Mathematics was his refuge, a world where everything made sense, where there were definitive answers, where he could escape the pain and injustice of his daily reality. "Now, who can tell me what 3/5 of 25 is?" Mrs. Taylor asked the class. Hands shot up around the room, but Marcus remained focused on his own work. "Marcus?" Mrs. Taylor called, noticing his distraction. "Would you like to join us?" Startled, Marcus looked up. 15, he answered without hesitation. "That's correct. Can you explain how you got your answer?" "I multiplied 25 by 3 and then divided by 5, Marcus explained simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Mrs. Taylor smiled. "Very good. Now, let's try something more challenging. What's 7/8 of 64? Again, Marcus answered instantly. 56. A few students whispered among themselves. Marcus had always been quick with numbers, but lately, Mrs. Taylor had noticed something extraordinary about his abilities. He wasn't just fast, he seemed to see mathematics in a fundamentally different way than most people. After class, as students filed out for lunch, Mrs. Taylor approached Marcus. "May I see your notebook, Marcus?" Hesitantly, he handed it over. Mrs. Taylor's eyes widened as she flipped through pages filled with complex equations, geometric proofs, and mathematical concepts far beyond 5th grade level, beyond high school level, even. "Marcus, where did you learn all this?" "The library," he answered simply. "And some YouTube videos." Mrs. Taylor sat down, suddenly aware she was in the presence of something remarkable. "Would you mind showing me how you solved this?" she asked, pointing to a particularly complex calculus problem. As Marcus explained, standing beside her desk, wincing slightly as he leaned forward, Mrs. Taylor realized that the quiet boy who never sat down might just be the most brilliant mathematical mind she had ever encountered. The faculty lounge buzzed with excitement as Mrs. Taylor rushed in, clutching Marcus's notebook to her chest. She made a beeline for Principal Davis, who was stirring creamer into his coffee. "James, you need to see this," she declared, placing the notebook on the table. "This is Marcus Johnson's work, the 5th grader who always stands in my class." Principal Davis adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. His brow furrowed as he flipped through the pages. "These are college-level equations," he remarked, his voice laced with disbelief. And the boy solved these himself? Not only solved them, derived new approaches to some of them, Mrs. Taylor explained. I've never seen anything like it. The principal's office became a flurry of activity in the days that followed. Calls were made to the district's gifted program coordinator. A mathematics professor from the local community college was brought in to assess Marcus's abilities. Each evaluation confirmed what Mrs. Taylor had discovered: Marcus Johnson was a mathematical prodigy of exceptional caliber. At home, Marcus sat on the floor of the small apartment he shared with his mother, using cushions to support his back as he worked through a book of mathematical puzzles. His mother, Dr. Amara Johnson, entered wearing her hospital scrubs, exhaustion evident in her eyes after a double shift. "Baby, why aren't you using the desk?" she asked, setting down her bag. "My back was hurting too much today," Marcus admitted. "The floor's better sometimes." Amara's face clouded with concern and lingering anger. The school's dismissal of Ms. Winter's abuse still haunted her, how the administration had questioned whether Marcus had provoked the teacher, how they'd suggested he was exaggerating his injury, how they'd ultimately given Ms. Winters nothing more than a written warning. "I got a call from your principal today," Amara said, sitting beside her son. "Mrs. Taylor has been showing them your math work." Marcus looked up, anxiety flashing across his face. "Am I in trouble?" "No, baby. Quite the opposite." She smiled, pushing aside her fatigue. "They've received an invitation from Harvard University. A famous mathematics professor is giving a special lecture and demonstration next month, and they want to bring exceptional students from around the country. Your school has been invited to send their top math students, and they want you to go." Marcus's eyes widened. "Harvard? Really?" "Really," Amara confirmed, her heart swelling with pride even as worry crept in. How would her son manage the trip with his back pain? Would the new environment be welcoming or hostile? The next day, Mrs. Taylor officially presented the invitation to Marcus after class. "This is a remarkable opportunity," she explained. "Professor Richard Whitmore is one of the most renowned mathematicians in the world. He's giving a special lecture on unsolved mathematical problems, and he'll be presenting a new challenge he's been working on." Will there be somewhere I can stand?" Marcus asked quietly, his excitement tempered by practical concerns. Mrs. Taylor's expression softened. "We'll make sure of it. I'll be accompanying the students, and I'll personally ensure you have whatever accommodations you need." As word spread through the school, reactions were mixed. Some teachers expressed genuine excitement for Marcus, while others muttered that it was inappropriate to reward a student who refused to follow simple classroom rules like sitting at a desk. 2 weeks before the Harvard trip, Principal Davis called Marcus and his mother for a meeting. They sat across from him, Marcus fidgeting uncomfortably in his chair. "Mrs. Johnson, Dr. Johnson," Amara corrected firmly. The principal blinked. "I apologize, Dr. Johnson. I wanted to discuss some concerns about Marcus's participation in the Harvard visit." "What concerns?" Amara asked, her voice tight. "Some faculty members feel that Marcus's standing habit might be disruptive in such a prestigious setting. They're concerned about the impression it might give." Before Amara could respond, Mrs. Taylor, who had been invited to the meeting, spoke up. "With all due respect, Principal Davis, Marcus's mathematical gift is extraordinary. If Harvard doesn't mind accommodating a standing student, why should we?" The principal cleared his throat. "I'm merely suggesting that perhaps Marcus could make an effort to." "My son stands because he's in pain," Amara interrupted, her voice razor-sharp. "Pain caused by a teacher at this very school. A teacher who faced no real consequences for physically abusing a child." The room fell silent. Marcus stared at his hands, wishing he could disappear. "Marcus will attend the Harvard lecture," Amara continued firmly. "And he will stand if he needs to stand. The only impression anyone should be concerned about is the impression we make when we fail to accommodate a child's needs." As they left the office, Marcus whispered, "Thank you, Mom." Amara squeezed his hand. "Always, baby. Always." Professor Richard Whitmore strode through the mathematics department at Harvard, his tailored suit and perfectly polished shoes reflecting his meticulous nature. At 57, with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he embodied the stereotype of the distinguished academic, and he knew it. His office walls were adorned with framed awards, honorary degrees, and photographs of him with various intellectual luminaries. "Professor, the preparations for next week's special lecture are finalized," his teaching assistant, Michael Chen, reported, his tablet in hand. "We've received confirmation from all 12 schools that will be attending." 12. Whitmore frowned, pausing before his office door. "I thought we agreed on 10. Michael shifted uncomfortably. Dean Phillips added 2 more. She thought it would be beneficial to include some schools from more diverse districts. Whitmore's lips thinned with disapproval. "This isn't a social experiment, Mr. Chen. It's a demonstration of advanced mathematical concepts. I doubt students from underfunded districts will be able to follow along, much less benefit from the experience." "With respect, sir, talent can come from anywhere," Michael ventured. "Talent, perhaps. Genius requires nurturing, resources, and proper educational foundations," Whitmore replied dismissively. "Nevertheless, we'll proceed. Please ensure there are adequate seating arrangements. I won't have disruptions from fidgeting children who don't belong here." Inside his office, Whitmore turned his attention to the mathematical problem he planned to present, an elegant, complex challenge he had been refining for months. It wasn't truly unsolvable, of course. Whitmore himself had developed a solution. But it required such advanced knowledge of differential equations and non-Euclidean geometry that he was confident no one in the audience, not even his colleagues, would be able to solve it on the spot. The door opened after a brief knock, and Dean Eleanor Phillips entered. In her early 60s, with a crown of silver curls and penetrating dark eyes, she commanded respect without demanding it, a quality Whitmore secretly envied. "Richard, do you have a moment?" "For you, Eleanor, always," he responded with practiced charm. She settled into the chair across from him. "I wanted to discuss the upcoming lecture. I understand you're planning to present your newest problem." "Indeed. A demonstration of mathematical thinking at its highest level. And the purpose is—" Whitmore raised an eyebrow. "To inspire, to challenge, to demonstrate the beauty and complexity of advanced mathematics. To humble, perhaps," Dean Phillips suggested with a knowing look. Whitmore chuckled. "I wouldn't put it so crudely, but yes, there's value in understanding one's limitations. Too many students arrive at Harvard believing they're exceptional, only to discover they're merely adequate." Dean Phillips studied him for a moment. "Richard, I've added several schools to the invitation list. Schools that wouldn't normally have access to such opportunities." "So Mr. Chen informed me," Whitmore replied, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "While I appreciate your social consciousness, I'm concerned it may dilute the experience for the students who are truly prepared for this level of mathematics." "Or perhaps it might surprise you," she countered. "Brilliance doesn't check zip codes before taking root." "No, but it does require fertile soil to flourish," he retorted. "I've spent 40 years in mathematics education, Eleanor. I can count on one hand the number of truly exceptional minds I've encountered, and none came from underprivileged backgrounds." "Perhaps you weren't looking in the right places," she suggested mildly. The conversation was interrupted by another knock. Michael Chen appeared in the doorway, accompanied by Professor Javier Rodriguez from the Computer Science Department. "Sorry to interrupt," Michael said. Professor Rodriguez wanted to discuss the computational aspects of the problem for next week's demonstration. As the men began a technical discussion, Dean Phillips rose to leave. At the door, she paused. "Richard, I've been an educator for over 40 years myself. And in my experience, the most dangerous words in academia are, 'it can't be done' and 'it's never happened before.' Keep an open mind next week. You might be surprised." Whitmore nodded politely, but internally dismissed her advice. His problem was meticulously crafted, requiring knowledge of mathematical principles that even most Harvard undergraduates hadn't yet mastered. The idea that a high school student could solve it was far-fetched, the notion that a student from an underfunded district might do so was, in his mind, absurd. Later that evening, as Whitmore reviewed his presentation one final time, Michael ventured another comment. "Sir, I've been looking at the list of attending schools. There's one, Westwood Elementary, that's sending a 5th grade student." Whitmore looked up, genuine surprise crossing his face. "A 5th grader? That's preposterous. This lecture is designed for advanced high school students, at minimum." "Apparently, he's some kind of prodigy," Michael explained. "His teacher sent samples of his work. I left them on your desk." Whitmore glanced at the folder but made no move to open it. "A prodigy," he repeated skeptically. "Well, he can observe, but I won't be simplifying my presentation for a child." "Of course not, sir," Michael replied diplomatically. "Though I did notice one other thing in his file. Apparently, he stands during class due to some sort of back injury." "Stands?" Whitmore's brow furrowed with irritation. "That won't do. It would be disruptive. Please inform the school that proper seating etiquette will be expected at Harvard." "Sir, if it's a medical issue, then they should provide appropriate documentation and request accommodations through proper channels," Whitmore interrupted. "This institution has procedures, Mr. Chen. I won't have my lecture turned into a spectacle." As Michael left, Whitmore dismissed the matter from his mind. The upcoming demonstration would cement his reputation as one of the foremost mathematical minds of his generation. A standing child from an elementary school was the least of his concerns. 6 months earlier, Marcus sat straight-backed in Ms. Winter's 4th grade classroom, his eyes fixed on the whiteboard where she was explaining multiplication of fractions. The classroom was stiflingly hot that day, the ancient air conditioning system having failed again, but Marcus remained focused despite the discomfort. "So when we multiply these fractions," Ms. Winters was saying, writing on the board, "we get 3/8 times 2/5 equals 6/40, which simplifies to 3/20." Marcus frowned slightly. Something didn't look right in her calculation. He double-checked the work in his head and then hesitantly raised his hand. "Yes, Marcus." Ms. Winters acknowledged him with barely concealed impatience. She had made her dislike of Marcus clear from the first week of school, when he had correctly solved problems meant to challenge the class. "I think the answer should be 3/20, not 6/40, Marcus said quietly. Ms. Winters' expression hardened. "I just said it simplifies to 3/20. "No, you said it equals 6/40 first, but that's not right," Marcus persisted. 3/8 times 2/5 is 6/40, not 6/40. A few students giggled at his correction, and Ms. Winters' face flushed. She walked over to Marcus's desk, ruler in hand. "Are you saying I made a mistake?" she asked, her voice dangerously low. Marcus swallowed hard but nodded. "Yes, ma'am. The multiplication is wrong. It should be." The ruler came down hard across his desk, making him jump. "Stand up," Ms. Winters ordered. Marcus complied, confusion and fear mingling in his eyes. "Turn around and face the class," she instructed. As Marcus turned, Ms. Winters struck him across his lower back with the ruler. The sharp, unexpected pain made him gasp and stumble forward. "That's for disrupting my class and undermining my authority," she hissed, loud enough for the front row to hear. "Now sit down and keep your mouth shut." Shaking and fighting tears, Marcus lowered himself back into his seat. The pain radiated across his back, but the humiliation burned even hotter. No one in the class spoke or moved, shock had rendered them silent. That evening, when Amara returned from her nursing shift, she found Marcus lying on his stomach on the living room floor, homework spread around him. "Baby, why are you on the floor?" she asked, setting down her bags. When Marcus explained what had happened, Amara's exhaustion vanished, replaced by cold fury. She examined his back, finding an angry welt that had already begun to bruise. "Get your coat," she said, her voice trembling with controlled rage. "We're going to the emergency room, and then we're going to talk to your principal." The emergency room doctor documented the injury, a severe contusion with potential damage to the underlying muscle tissue. He provided pain medication and advised against prolonged sitting until the injury healed. The next morning, Amara marched into Principal Davis's office, medical report in hand. Marcus waited outside, standing by the secretary's desk, too uncomfortable to sit in the offered chair. What followed was a travesty of justice that would haunt both mother and son. Principal Davis expressed concern but suggested Marcus might have misunderstood or exaggerated what happened. When Amara presented the medical evidence, he shifted tactics, implying that Marcus might have provoked Ms. Winters with his attitude. "My son's attitude was correcting a mathematical error," Amara said, her voice deadly quiet. "For that, he was physically assaulted." The meeting ended with vague promises to look into the matter and take appropriate action. A week later, they learned that Ms. Winters had received only a written warning. No suspension. No termination. Not even a formal reprimand in her permanent record. "We have to consider her 20 years of service," Principal Davis explained when Amara called to express her outrage. And there were no witnesses who could confirm exactly what happened. "There were 24 students in that classroom," Amara responded incredulously. "None of whom have come forward to support Marcus's version of events," he countered smoothly. What neither Amara nor Marcus knew was that Ms. Winters had threatened the entire class with failing grades if anyone told tales. Fear had silenced every potential witness. In the weeks that followed, Marcus's back pain persisted. Follow-up medical examinations revealed that the injury had affected a nerve. While not permanent, the damage would take months to fully heal. Sitting for more than 15 to 20 minutes caused significant discomfort. By the time Marcus transferred to Mrs. Taylor's class the following school year, standing during lessons had become his normal routine. His previous experiences had taught him a painful lesson: sometimes, the system that was supposed to protect him would fail spectacularly. His only defense was to excel beyond anyone's expectations, to become so exceptional that no one could dismiss him. As he stood at the back of Mrs. Taylor's classroom each day, solving equations far beyond his grade level, Marcus wasn't just learning mathematics, he was building armor against a world that seemed determined to put him in his place. The morning of the Harvard trip arrived with a mix of anticipation and anxiety for Marcus. He stood before the bathroom mirror, carefully buttoning his freshly pressed shirt, a gift from Mrs. Taylor, who had quietly purchased it after noticing his limited wardrobe during class field trips. "You look so handsome," Amara said, appearing in the doorway. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed her overnight shift, but her smile was radiant with pride. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Marcus asked, fidgeting with his collar. "What if Professor Whitmore doesn't want me standing during his lecture?" Amara knelt before her son, gently straightening his tie. "Then Professor Whitmore will have to deal with me," she said firmly. "But Mrs. Taylor has already arranged everything. You have permission to stand at the back of the lecture hall if you need to." She handed him a small backpack containing his essentials, a notebook, pens, his pain medication, and a cushion specially designed to support his back when sitting became unavoidable. "Remember," she said, cupping his face in her hands, "your mind is a gift. Don't let anyone make you feel small for how you need to learn." At the school, 5 other students had been selected to attend the Harvard visit, all 8th graders from the advanced mathematics program. They clustered together near the bus, casting curious glances at Marcus as he approached with Mrs. Taylor. "Everyone, I believe you know Marcus," Mrs. Taylor introduced him. "He'll be joining us for Professor Whitmore's lecture." "Isn't he in 5th grade?" one boy asked, not unkindly but with obvious confusion. "Mathematical talent doesn't always follow grade levels," Mrs. Taylor replied smoothly. "Marcus has demonstrated exceptional abilities that warrant this opportunity." On the 2-hour drive to Cambridge, Marcus sat alone, using his cushion to minimize discomfort. He flipped through a book on number theory, occasionally making notes in the margins. Mrs. Taylor checked on him periodically, offering words of encouragement. "Are you nervous?" she asked during one such visit. Marcus looked up from his book. "A little," he admitted. "I've read 3 of Professor Whitmore's papers. He's brilliant, but..." "But?" Mrs. Taylor prompted gently. "In his interviews, he talks a lot about proper mathematical foundations and rigorous training. He doesn't seem to think people can just understand mathematics naturally. Mrs. Taylor considered this. Some people believe talent must be cultivated in specific ways. Others recognize that brilliance often follows its own path. Just be yourself, Marcus. That's more than enough. As the Harvard campus came into view, with its historic buildings and sprawling grounds, a hush fell over the students. For many, including Marcus, this was their first glimpse of an elite university, a world that seemed as distant as the moon. "We're meeting in the mathematics department," Mrs. Taylor announced as they disembarked. "The lecture begins at 11, but Professor Whitmore's assistant will give us a tour first." Walking across Harvard Yard, Marcus felt simultaneously out of place and strangely at home. The academic atmosphere called to something deep within him, a sense that here, perhaps, his mind might finally find the challenges it craved. Outside the mathematics building, they were met by Michael Chen, who introduced himself as Professor Whitmore's graduate assistant. His kind smile and welcoming manner immediately put the group at ease. "Professor Whitmore is completing some final preparations," Michael explained, leading them inside. "I'll show you around the department before the lecture." As they walked, Michael fell into step beside Marcus. "So you're the fifth grader I've heard about," he said with genuine interest. "I saw some of your work. It's impressive." "Thank you," Marcus replied, surprised by the recognition. "I understand you might need to stand during the lecture?" Michael inquired quietly. Marcus tensed slightly. "Is that going to be a problem?" "Not at all," Michael assured him. "I've arranged for you to have space at the back of the hall where you can stand comfortably. Just one thing to know, Professor Whitmore can be a bit traditional in his expectations. If he says anything about it, try not to take it personally." Before Marcus could respond, they reached a display case filled with mathematical artifacts and historical documents. As Michael explained the significance of each item, Marcus's attention was caught by a framed letter. "That's correspondence between two mathematicians debating the solvability of the quintic equation," Michael explained, noticing his interest. "For centuries, people believed there must be a formula to solve all polynomial equations. It wasn't until the 19th century that mathematicians proved some problems simply cannot be solved with certain approaches. But that doesn't mean they're truly unsolvable," Marcus observed quietly. "Just that you need a different way of thinking about them." Michael studied the boy with newfound interest. "That's exactly right. Sometimes the breakthrough comes from approaching a problem from an entirely unexpected angle." As they continued the tour, Marcus felt a growing excitement. Despite his anxiety about the upcoming lecture, he couldn't help but feel that something important was about to happen, that somehow, his presence at Harvard today wasn't merely a field trip, but a turning point. The Maxwell Hall auditorium buzzed with anticipation as students and faculty filed in for Professor Whitmore's special lecture. The space was impressive. Tiered seating surrounded a central stage area where a large whiteboard and digital projector had been set up. The air itself seemed charged with intellect, the conversations around them peppered with mathematical terms and theoretical concepts. Marcus stood with Mrs. Taylor and his classmates in the entry area, where Michael was distributing programs. "We have students from 12 schools today," Michael explained. "Professor Whitmore will present an overview of famous unsolved problems in mathematics, followed by a demonstration of his latest work." Marcus glanced at the program, his eyes widening as he recognized several of the topics listed. He had been reading about these very problems in his library books. "Now," Michael continued, "you'll be seated in the fourth row. Marcus, as we discussed, there's space for you to stand at the back of the middle section if you need to." As they moved toward their seats, a tall, distinguished man in a precisely tailored suit entered through a side door. Even without an introduction, Marcus knew immediately that this was Professor Richard Whitmore. The professor's presence commanded attention, his ramrod-straight posture, piercing gaze, and the air of absolute authority that surrounded him. Professor Whitmore surveyed the gathering crowd with a critical eye, his gaze pausing momentarily on the younger students. His expression flickered with what might have been disapproval before he turned to confer with a colleague. The students took their seats, Marcus following Mrs. Taylor to the row assigned to their school. He tried sitting, adjusting his cushion carefully, hoping the excitement of the day might distract from his discomfort. Dean Eleanor Phillips stepped to the podium to introduce the event. Her warm, authoritative voice welcomed everyone to Harvard and spoke eloquently about the importance of mathematical education and discovery. Today, she concluded, we are privileged to hear from one of our most distinguished faculty members. Professor Richard Whitmore has contributed groundbreaking work to the fields of geometric analysis and differential equations. Please join me in welcoming him. Polite applause filled the auditorium as Professor Whitmore took the stage. He adjusted the microphone with methodical precision before speaking. Mathematics, he began, his voice resonant and cultivated, is the language in which God wrote the universe. It is also, unfortunately, a language that few truly master. His eyes swept across the audience. I've been asked to speak today about unsolved problems in mathematics, challenges that have resisted the efforts of our greatest minds. Before we delve into those, however, I wish to emphasize a crucial point: true mathematical ability requires not just natural aptitude, but years of rigorous, structured education. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the professor's words echoing his earlier concerns. After 10 minutes, the pain in his back became distracting. Quietly, he whispered to Mrs. Taylor that he needed to stand, then made his way to the back of the section where Michael had indicated. Professor Whitmore paused mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing as he tracked Marcus's movement. "Young man," he called out, his voice sharp. "Is there a problem with your seat?" The auditorium fell silent. All eyes turned toward Marcus, who froze halfway up the aisle. I need to stand, sir," Marcus replied, his voice barely audible in the cavernous space. "This is a university lecture, not a social gathering," Professor Whitmore said coldly. "Either return to your seat or step outside. Standing during my presentation is disruptive and disrespectful." Before Marcus could respond, Mrs. Taylor rose from her seat. "Professor Whitmore, Marcus has a medical condition that makes prolonged sitting painful. We received prior approval for him to stand at the back." The professor's expression hardened. "I was not informed of any such arrangement. This is most irregular." Dean Phillips, who had been seated in the front row, stood and approached the stage. She spoke quietly to Professor Whitmore, whose face registered first surprise, then irritation, and finally reluctant acceptance. "Very well," he said stiffly into the microphone. "The young man may stand at the back. Let us continue." Marcus made his way to the designated area, his face burning with embarrassment. Michael, standing nearby, gave him an encouraging nod. As the lecture proceeded, Professor Whitmore displayed a series of famous mathematical problems on the screen behind him, explaining their significance and the failed attempts to solve them throughout history. Despite his humiliation, Marcus found himself drawn into the professor's explanations. For all his arrogance, Whitmore was undeniably brilliant, and his insights into these mathematical challenges were fascinating. "Many believe these problems are unsolvable," Whitmore was saying, "but I prefer to think of them as awaiting the right mind, the right approach, one built upon proper mathematical foundations." He clicked to the next slide, revealing a complex equation filled with symbols that elicited murmurs from the audience. "This brings me to the culmination of our session today. This is a problem I've been developing over the past year, a particular case of non-Euclidean geometry with applications to quantum field theory. While not technically unsolvable, it requires such specific knowledge and insight that I believe it would challenge even my most advanced doctoral students." Marcus stared at the equation, his mind already beginning to dissect its components, seeing patterns and relationships forming like constellations. "I've presented this problem at 3 other universities," Professor Whitmore continued with unconcealed pride. "Thus far, no one has been able to solve it on the spot. I include it today not to frustrate you, but to demonstrate that mathematics at its highest levels requires years of dedicated study." He turned to the audience with a thin smile. "Nevertheless, before I reveal my solution, I'll offer the traditional challenge: would anyone like to attempt it?" The auditorium remained silent. Even the Harvard faculty members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unwilling to risk failure in such a public forum. Marcus barely heard the professor's smug chuckle as he continued to stare at the equation. In his mind, the symbols were rearranging themselves, revealing hidden symmetries, suggesting alternative approaches. The solution was unfolding before him like a flower opening to the sun. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Marcus raised his hand. The auditorium fell silent. Professor Whitmore, who had already begun to turn away from the audience, paused mid-stride. His eyes narrowed as he spotted Marcus's raised hand at the back of the hall. "Yes," he asked, his tone a mixture of irritation and disbelief. "Do you have a question about the problem?" "No, sir," Marcus replied, his voice wavering slightly but carrying in the hushed space. "I'd like to try solving it." A ripple of whispers spread through the audience. Professor Whitmore's expression shifted from surprise to barely concealed amusement. "Young man, perhaps you misunderstood. This problem involves concepts from advanced differential geometry and non-Euclidean calculus. It's not a grade school arithmetic puzzle." Marcus swallowed hard but kept his hand raised. "I understand, sir. I'd still like to try." Mrs. Taylor stood up from her seat, turning to face Marcus with a questioning look. He gave her a small nod, and she smiled in return, a silent exchange of trust. Professor Whitmore glanced at Dean Phillips, who was watching the interaction with keen interest. She raised an eyebrow, an unspoken challenge in her expression. "Very well," the professor said with a dismissive wave. "Come forward. Though I must warn everyone not to expect too much from this exercise." As Marcus made his way to the front of the auditorium, he could feel every eye on him. The weight of attention pressed against him like a physical force, but the mathematical puzzle on the screen pulled him forward more powerfully than his anxiety could push him back. Mrs. Taylor intercepted him at the front row. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. "I think I see how to approach it," Marcus replied quietly. "It's like a puzzle where the pieces look complicated, but they fit together in a simple way if you turn them right." She squeezed his shoulder gently. "Show them what you can do." At the front of the hall, Professor Whitmore handed Marcus a marker with obvious reluctance. "The floor is yours," he said, his tone making it clear that he expected nothing but embarrassment to follow. Marcus stared at the complex equation projected on the screen, then turned to the whiteboard beside it. For a moment, he stood motionless, absorbing the problem in its entirety. The auditorium was so quiet that the soft squeak of the marker cap being removed seemed amplified. He began to write, his hand moving with surprising confidence. First, he rearranged the equation, breaking it down into manageable components. Then he applied a transformation that simplified one of the more complex terms. Several audience members leaned forward in their seats, expressions of confusion or interest crossing their faces. "That's not the standard approach," one of the Harvard professors murmured to a colleague. Marcus continued working, oblivious to the growing tension in the room. When he encountered a particularly difficult term, he paused, closed his eyes briefly, then suddenly smiled and wrote down a substitution that elegantly bypassed the obstacle. Professor Whitmore, who had been watching with increasing discomfort, stepped closer to the board. "Young man, what you're attempting isn't." "Please," Dean Phillips interrupted from her seat. "Let him continue, Richard." The professor fell silent, his lips pressed into a thin line as Marcus worked through another step of his solution. In the audience, Michael Chen had pulled out his phone and was quietly filming the scene. Mrs. Taylor watched with proud amazement, while the other students from Westwood Elementary exchanged bewildered glances, seeing their young classmate in an entirely new light. After nearly 10 minutes of focused work, with the whiteboard now covered in mathematical notation, Marcus stepped back. He reviewed his work once more, made a small correction to one term, then turned to face Professor Whitmore. "I think this is the solution," he said simply. The key was recognizing that the non-Euclidean components could be mapped to a higher dimensional space where the relationships become linear. Professor Whitmore stared at the board, his expression unreadable. He traced the steps of Marcus's solution, checking each transformation, each substitution. The audience held its collective breath. This approach, the professor finally said, his voice strained, is not the standard method. It's not how I derived the solution. Does that mean it's wrong? Marcus asked, a flicker of doubt crossing his face for the first time. Before Professor Whitmore could respond, another faculty member rose from his seat and approached the board. He was an older man with wild white hair and a perpetual squint. May I? He asked, gesturing toward Marcus's work. The boy nodded and stepped aside. The professor examined the solution line by line, occasionally muttering to himself. After a minute, he turned to Professor Whitmore with an expression of barely suppressed excitement. Richard, the boy's solution is valid. In fact, it's remarkably elegant, simpler than the approach you published in your paper last year. He's reduced the 15-step process to 8 steps by recognizing a symmetry that, frankly, I don't think any of us noticed. A murmur swept through the audience, growing louder as the implications became clear. Standing at the whiteboard, Marcus swayed slightly, the emotional and physical toll of the moment catching up with him. Mrs. Taylor quickly moved to his side. Are you all right? She asked quietly. My back, he whispered. It's starting to hurt a lot. I've been standing too long. As Mrs. Taylor supported Marcus, Professor Whitmore stared at the whiteboard, his carefully constructed worldview visibly crumbling around him. The impossible had just happened, and it had been accomplished by a child who, in his estimation, should not have been able to understand the problem, let alone solve it. Dean Phillips approached the podium with a smile that barely concealed her satisfaction. I believe this calls for a short break, she announced to the audience. When we return, perhaps Professor Whitmore would like to discuss this remarkable alternative solution with us. As the audience broke into spontaneous applause, Marcus finally allowed himself to be led to a chair at the side of the stage. The pain in his back was intense, but for the first time in months, it was overshadowed by something stronger, the pure joy of mathematical discovery, and the validation of his unique brilliance. 10 minutes before Marcus raised his hand, he had been standing at the back of the auditorium, his mind racing as Professor Whitmore displayed the supposedly insurmountable problem. Unlike the others in the audience who saw an impenetrable wall of symbols, Marcus perceived something different, a puzzle with pieces that could be rearranged, transformed, and connected in ways that weren't immediately obvious. As the professor's challenge hung in the air and silence filled the hall, Marcus felt a familiar sensation, the clarity that came when mathematics spoke to him in its pure, elegant language. His hand was in the air before his conscious mind had fully processed the decision. The shocked silence that followed his request to solve the problem seemed to stretch for an eternity. Each step toward the front of the hall was a battle against both physical pain and mounting anxiety. His back throbbed from standing throughout the lecture, and now all eyes were trained on him, the small black boy in clothes that, despite his mother's best efforts, still marked him as out of place among the sleek, confident Harvard students. When Professor Whitmore handed him the marker, his condescension was palpable. The floor is yours, he had said, in a tone that clearly communicated, go ahead and embarrass yourself. Yet when Marcus faced the board, something remarkable happened. The audience faded away. The pain receded to a distant signal. Even Professor Whitmore's skeptical presence diminished in importance. There was only the problem, the marker, and the solution unfolding in his mind like a blooming flower. Now, as the break Dean Phillips had called stretched into its 5th minute, Marcus sat in a chair hastily provided by Michael Chen, sipping water while Mrs. Taylor hovered protectively nearby. The auditorium buzzed with conversation, much of it centered on what they had just witnessed. That was incredible, Michael said, crouching beside Marcus's chair. How did you see that connection to higher dimensional space? Most mathematicians would approach it through conventional non-Euclidean methods. Marcus shrugged slightly, wincing as the movement aggravated his back. It just seemed obvious. Like the problem was trying too hard to stay in 3 dimensions when it wanted to be in 5. Michael laughed with genuine delight. That's actually a profound observation. Mathematics does sometimes have a will of its own, doesn't it? Across the stage, Professor Whitmore was engaged in an intense discussion with several faculty members, his gestures becoming increasingly defensive. Dean Phillips approached Marcus's chair, her expression warm. "How are you feeling, young man?" she asked gently. "My back hurts," Marcus admitted. "But I'm okay." Dean Phillips nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "What you did today was extraordinary. I don't think this auditorium has witnessed such a moment since a young Hungarian mathematician challenged Professor Newman in 1947. She turned to Mrs. Taylor. "Your student is quite remarkable. Has he been evaluated for advanced placement?" "We've been trying," Mrs. Taylor replied, her voice carrying a hint of frustration. "But there have been institutional barriers." Dean Phillips raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "I see. Well, perhaps after today, some of those barriers might be reconsidered." As she moved away, Professor Whitmore approached, his expression a complex mixture of emotions, professional curiosity warring with injured pride, academic interest competing with personal embarrassment. "Young man," he began stiffly, "your solution, while unorthodox, appears to be valid. May I ask where you learned this approach to non-Euclidean geometry?" Marcus looked up at the imposing figure of the professor. "I didn't learn it anywhere, sir. I just saw that if you mapped the problem to a higher dimension, the relationship simplified." "Impossible," Whitmore said sharply. "This level of mathematical insight doesn't emerge from nowhere. Someone must have guided you." Mrs. Taylor stepped forward. "Professor Whitmore, I can assure you that Marcus's abilities are entirely self-taught. He reads advanced mathematics texts from our public library and occasionally watches online lectures." "Self-taught?" Whitmore repeated incredulously. "In my 40 years of mathematical education, I have never encountered a truly self-taught prodigy. Talent must be cultivated through proper channels, structured learning, established methodologies." Marcus winced, not from his back pain this time, but from the dismissal implicit in the professor's words. Even after witnessing what he had done, Whitmore couldn't, or wouldn't, accept that Marcus's gift existed outside his rigid conception of how mathematical ability developed. "Why is it so hard to believe?" Marcus asked quietly, surprising himself with his boldness. "Why can't someone just understand mathematics without being taught the right way to think about it?" The question hung in the air, simple yet profound in its challenge to the professor's worldview. Whitmore opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, momentarily at a loss. The tense moment was interrupted as Dean Phillips returned to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd please retake your seats, we'll continue with our program." As the audience settled, Professor Whitmore was faced with a dilemma. His planned conclusion, a triumphant reveal of his solution to the impossible problem, had been rendered moot. Marcus's work on the whiteboard stood as testament to an approach that, by all accounts, was more elegant than his own. The professor cleared his throat. "In light of recent developments," he began, his voice carefully controlled, "I'd like to invite our young solver to explain his approach to the audience." The request caught Marcus by surprise. He looked to Mrs. Taylor, who nodded encouragingly. "My back," he whispered to her. "I don't think I can stand up there much longer." "I'll help you," she promised, supporting him as he rose from the chair. Together, they approached the whiteboard once more. The pain was etched clearly on Marcus's face now, but so was a determination that commanded respect from even the most skeptical observers. "Could we get a chair for the young man?" Dean Phillips called out, noticing his distress. "No need for that," Professor Whitmore said dismissively. "This won't take long." In that moment, something shifted in the atmosphere of the auditorium. The professor's callous disregard for Marcus's obvious pain, after the boy had just demonstrated extraordinary mathematical insight, struck many in the audience as particularly cruel. Michael Chen quickly retrieved a stool from backstage, placing it near the whiteboard despite his mentor's frown of disapproval. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, grateful for the support as he began to explain his solution. Despite his discomfort, Marcus's explanation was clear and insightful. He walked the audience through his thinking process, highlighting the key insight that had allowed him to approach the problem from a novel angle. Even those with limited mathematical background could appreciate the creativity and intuition behind his work. As Marcus concluded his explanation, the audience burst into spontaneous applause once again, louder and more sustained than before. It wasn't merely applause for mathematical brilliance now, but recognition of courage, of dignity in the face of discomfort and dismissal. Professor Whitmore stood to the side, his expression unreadable as he watched the young boy receive the ovation that he had expected for himself. For the first time in decades, Richard Whitmore found himself facing a question he couldn't answer with his considerable mathematical knowledge. How could everything he believed about talent, education, and opportunity be so fundamentally wrong? The applause finally subsided, leaving a charged atmosphere in the auditorium. Marcus sat on the stool beside his solution, the stark white board filled with his elegant mathematical reasoning. Professor Whitmore stood nearby, his composure somewhat recovered but his worldview visibly shaken. Perhaps, Dean Phillips suggested from the front row, Professor Whitmore could share his own approach to the problem now. It would be instructive to compare the two methods. The professor straightened his tie, a nervous gesture that betrayed his discomfort. Yes, of course, he replied, moving to the second whiteboard that had been set up on the stage. As Whitmore began writing out his solution, the contrast between the approaches became increasingly apparent. Where Marcus had seen a direct path through higher dimensional space, Whitmore had constructed an elaborate framework of conventional techniques, each step meticulously derived, perfectly correct, but ultimately more complex. As you can see, the professor explained, his voice regaining some of its earlier authority, my approach follows established methodologies in non-Euclidean geometry. It's more, technically rigorous, though I concede that Mr. Johnson's solution reaches the same conclusion through a more direct route. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement that Marcus would receive from the professor, a grudging admission that the boy's intuitive leap had bypassed weeks of Whitmore's careful calculations. From the audience, a hand rose. It belonged to a young woman in the front row, a Harvard graduate student studying theoretical physics. Professor Whitmore, she said when acknowledged, I'm curious about something. Marcus's solution seems to suggest that the problem has applications beyond the field you initially described. The mapping to higher dimensions could have implications for string theory and brane cosmology. Had you considered those connections? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Professor Whitmore opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a small voice interrupted. I thought about that too, Marcus said, his natural enthusiasm for mathematics temporarily overcoming his shyness. If you extend the solution to 7 dimensions instead of 5, you get a framework that might explain quantum entanglement more elegantly than current models. The auditorium fell silent. The casual observation from a 10-year-old boy had just connected 2 major fields of theoretical physics in a way that even specialists rarely attempted. That's actually a fascinating insight, the graduate student replied, looking at Marcus with newfound respect. Would you mind elaborating? As Marcus began to explain his thinking, sketching additional equations on a corner of the whiteboard, Professor Whitmore watched with a complex mixture of emotions crossing his face. Professional interest warred with wounded pride, scientific curiosity battled with entrenched beliefs about who could and could not contribute to advanced mathematics. Dean Phillips moved to stand beside the professor. Remarkable, isn't he? She said quietly. He's unusual, Whitmore conceded reluctantly. Though I maintain that without proper training, such raw talent will never reach its full potential. Perhaps, Dean Phillips replied thoughtfully, or perhaps our definition of proper training needs reconsideration. Not everyone thrives in the same educational environment, Richard. The conversation was interrupted as Marcus suddenly swayed on his stool, his face contorting with pain. Mrs. Taylor rushed forward to steady him. I think that's enough for today, she announced firmly. Marcus needs to rest. Dean Phillips immediately agreed. Of course. We've already extended well beyond our scheduled time. She turned to address the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we've all witnessed something extraordinary today. Thank you for your attention and participation. As the crowd began to disperse, many audience members approached the stage, eager to speak with Marcus. Graduate students, professors, and even some of the high school students from other schools formed an impromptu receiving line. Your approach to the higher dimensional mapping was brilliant, one professor told him. Have you considered publishing your method? Another asked. Would you be interested in attending our summer mathematics program? A third inquired. Overwhelmed by the attention and increasingly distressed by his back pain, Marcus leaned heavily against Mrs. Taylor. Seeing his distress, Michael Chen intervened, gently dispersing the crowd. I think our young mathematician needs some space, he announced. Perhaps we could continue these discussions another time. As the well-wishers reluctantly moved away, Professor Whitmore approached Marcus once more. His expression had softened slightly, professional curiosity seemingly winning out over wounded pride. Young man, he said, his tone measured, your solution was unexpected. I would be interested in discussing your approach further, perhaps after you've had some rest. Before Marcus could respond, a sharp voice cut through the moment. He needs medical attention, not more mathematics. Amara Johnson strode into the auditorium, her hospital scrubs partially concealed under a hastily donned coat, her expression a mixture of concern and fierce pride. She had received Mrs. Taylor's text about what had transpired and had immediately left work to come to Harvard. Mom, Marcus said, his face lighting up despite his pain. You came. Of course I came, Amara replied, embracing her son carefully. Mrs. Taylor told me what happened. That you solved an impossible problem in front of everyone. She turned to Professor Whitmore, instantly identifying him as the authority figure in the room. My son needs medical attention. He has a back injury that makes standing painful, and he's been on his feet far too long. Professor Whitmore blinked, taken aback by her direct manner. Ah, yes, of course. The University Medical Center is just across the quad. I'm a registered nurse, Amara interrupted. I'll assess him myself first. As she helped Marcus to a more comfortable position, checking his pulse and examining his back with practiced efficiency, Professor Whitmore watched with growing discomfort. The pieces were coming together in his mind, the boy's insistence on standing, Mrs. Taylor's protective attitude, the medical accommodation that Dean Phillips had mentioned. What exactly is the nature of his injury? He asked, his voice losing some of its authoritative edge. Amara looked up, her eyes meeting the professor's with unwavering intensity. My son was struck across his back by a teacher. For correcting her mathematics. The blunt statement landed like a physical blow. Professor Whitmore paled visibly, his eyes darting from Amara to Marcus, who sat with his head bowed, embarrassment and pain etched across his young face. Struck by a teacher, the professor repeated, genuine shock in his voice. Yes, Amara confirmed flatly. And the school did nothing meaningful about it. The injury damaged a nerve cluster. Sitting for extended periods causes him significant pain. A heavy silence fell over the small group. Michael Chen stared at the floor, Mrs. Taylor placed a protective hand on Marcus's shoulder, and Professor Whitmore stood frozen, his carefully constructed worldview crumbling around him. In that moment, the true magnitude of what Marcus had overcome to solve the impossible problem became clear. Not just the mathematical challenge itself, not just the intimidating setting of Harvard University, not just the dismissive attitude of a renowned professor, but physical pain, systemic injustice, and the weight of expectations that would have crushed most adults, let alone a 10-year-old child. I had no idea, Professor Whitmore finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. No, Amara agreed, her tone softening slightly as she recognized the genuine shock in his expression. Most people don't. They see a black boy who won't sit down, and they make assumptions about defiance or disrespect. They don't consider that there might be reasons, important reasons, for his behavior. As the implications of her words sank in, something shifted in Professor Whitmore's expression, the first crack in a lifetime of unchallenged assumptions about talent, opportunity, and who belonged in the world of elite mathematics. The day after the lecture, Harvard's mathematics department found itself at the center of an unexpected media storm. Michael Chen's video of Marcus solving the impossible problem had gone viral overnight, shared by mathematics enthusiasts, educators, and advocates for gifted children across multiple platforms. Harvard professor stunned as 10-year-old solves unsolvable problem, read one headline. Black elementary student challenges elite mathematicians' assumptions, proclaimed another. In Professor Whitmore's spacious office, the atmosphere was tense. Dean Phillips sat across from him, a tablet displaying yet another news article about the previous day's events. "This isn't going away, Richard," she said, setting the tablet on his desk. "The university president has already called me twice this morning. People are asking questions about our outreach to underrepresented communities in STEM fields." Professor Whitmore stared out the window, his usual confidence notably absent. "I've been thinking about nothing else since yesterday," he admitted. "That boy's solution it was beautiful in its simplicity. The kind of insight that comes perhaps once in a generation." "And yet you initially dismissed him," Dean Phillips observed, not unkindly but firmly. "Because he didn't fit your conception of what mathematical talent looks like." "I dismissed him because he's 10 years old," Whitmore replied defensively. "Any reasonable person would question whether a child could solve a problem designed to challenge doctoral candidates. Would you have given him the chance to try if he'd been sitting quietly in the audience, rather than standing at the back? If he'd been wearing a prep school uniform instead of clothes that marked him as being from a modest background?" Dean Phillips pressed. "Be honest with yourself, Richard. For once." The professor's silence was answer enough. "And then there's the matter of his injury," Dean Phillips continued. "A child physically abused by an educator for displaying his mathematical gift, the very gift you claim to want to nurture in society. That situation is abhorrent," Whitmore said firmly. "No child should ever be treated that way, regardless of the circumstances." "Yet it happened," Dean Phillips replied. "And the system that should have protected him failed to do so. Just as our academic system frequently fails children like Marcus, those who don't have the right background, the right connections, or the right appearance to be recognized for their potential." Professor Whitmore ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration that would have shocked his students, who knew him only as the epitome of composure. "What would you have me do, Eleanor? I can't undo what happened yesterday." "No," she agreed, "but you can help determine what happens next. That boy and his mother are still in Cambridge. Michael tells me they're staying at the University Inn at my invitation. I'd like you to meet with them, not to apologize, though that wouldn't be amiss, but to discuss Marcus's future." "His future?" "Richard, you know as well as I do that a mind like his needs proper nurturing. Not just standard gifted programs or skipping a few grades. He needs a completely individualized educational approach." The professor nodded slowly. "You're right, of course. Talent of that magnitude appears rarely. To waste it would be." He trailed off, unable to find adequate words. "A tragedy," Dean Phillips supplied. "And a failure of our responsibility as educators." Meanwhile, in a modest room at the University Inn, Marcus sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by books that Michael Chen had brought from the mathematics department library. Despite the previous day's events and the lingering pain in his back, his focus was complete as he worked through an advanced text on topology. Amara watched her son from the small desk where she was reviewing emails that had flooded her inbox overnight. Universities, private schools, gifted programs, educational advocates, and even a few celebrities had reached out, offering everything from full scholarships to media appearances. "Mom, look at this," Marcus called out, holding up the book. "This proof connects to what I was trying to explain yesterday about seven-dimensional space." Amara smiled, marveling at her son's resilience and his ability to lose himself in mathematical concepts that were far beyond her understanding. Despite everything he had endured, the physical pain, the public humiliation, the systemic barriers, his passion for mathematics remained pure and joyful. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Amara rose to answer it, expecting Michael Chen, who had promised to return with lunch. Instead, she found herself face to face with Professor Whitmore, his tall figure somehow less imposing than it had appeared on stage. "Dr. Johnson," he said formally. "I was hoping I might speak with you and your son." Dean Phillips suggested this might be a convenient time. Amara hesitated, protective instincts flaring. "My son has been through quite enough already, Professor." "I understand," Whitmore replied, his tone lacking its usual confidence. I assure you I'm not here to cause any further distress. Quite the opposite, in fact. After a moment's consideration, Amara stepped aside to allow him entry. Marcus looked up from his books, surprise and wariness crossing his face as he recognized the professor. "Hello, Marcus," Professor Whitmore said, making a visible effort to soften his usual authoritative tone. "I hope you're feeling better today." "My back still hurts," Marcus replied honestly. "But the books help me forget about it." The professor glanced at the advanced topology text with undisguised interest. "That's graduate-level material." Marcus shrugged. "The pictures help me understand the concepts. And the math makes sense once you see the patterns." Professor Whitmore knelt down to examine the notes Marcus had been making, pages of calculations and diagrams that showed not just comprehension of the material, but extensions and connections that went beyond the text itself. "This is remarkable," he murmured, almost to himself. Then, looking directly at Marcus, he asked, "How long have you been studying mathematics at this level?" "Since I was 7, I guess," Marcus replied. "That's when I found the calculus books at the library. The librarian tried to tell me they were too advanced, but she let me check them out anyway." Amara watched the interaction carefully, ready to intervene at the first sign that the professor might dismiss or belittle her son's self-directed education. But to her surprise, Whitmore was listening with genuine attention, occasionally asking clarifying questions that seemed designed to understand Marcus's learning process rather than to test or challenge him. After several minutes of mathematical discussion, the professor straightened up with a slight grimace, whether from kneeling on the floor or from the humbling realization of Marcus's talents, it wasn't clear. "Dr. Johnson," he said, turning to Amara, "I owe both you and your son an apology. My behavior yesterday was inexcusable. I allowed preconceptions and arrogance to cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I failed in my duty as an educator." The admission, delivered with evident difficulty but apparent sincerity, caught Amara off guard. She had expected defensiveness or perhaps a carefully worded non-apology. This straightforward acknowledgement of fault was unexpected. "Thank you for that, Professor," she replied cautiously. "But I'm more concerned about what happens next. This sudden attention is overwhelming, and Marcus's well-being is my priority." Whitmore nodded. "That's actually why I'm here. With your permission, I'd like to discuss some possibilities for Marcus's education going forward. Dean Phillips and I have been consulting with colleagues in our department and in the School of Education." As he outlined potential pathways, specialized mentorship programs, custom-designed curricula, access to university resources while maintaining appropriate social development with peers, Amara noticed something shift in his demeanor. The dismissive arrogance had been replaced by something that resembled genuine respect. "What do you think, Marcus?" she asked, after the professor had finished presenting the options. "This would be a big change." Marcus looked thoughtful, his young face serious beyond his years. "Would I still have to sit at a desk all day?" he asked directly. Professor Whitmore blinked, then responded with unexpected understanding. "No, Marcus. Any educational program would be adapted to accommodate your needs, including alternatives to traditional seating arrangements." For the first time since the professor had entered the room, Marcus smiled. "Then I think I'd like to learn more." As they continued discussing possibilities, Michael Chin arrived with lunch and joined the conversation, adding perspective as someone who had recently navigated the educational pipeline that Marcus might enter. Throughout the meeting, Amara observed the interactions carefully, noting how Professor Whitmore, perhaps for the first time in his career, was truly listening to a child, treating Marcus's insights and concerns with the same seriousness he would accord a colleague. It was, she realized, the beginning of a transformation, not just for Marcus, whose extraordinary gifts would now have a chance to flourish, but perhaps also for Whitmore himself, whose lifetime of assumptions about talent and potential had been fundamentally challenged by a 10-year-old boy who preferred to stand rather than sit. 3 days after the famous lecture, Michael Chin sat in his small apartment near Harvard Square, reviewing the footage he had captured of Marcus solving Professor Whitmore's problem. What had begun as a spontaneous decision to document an unusual moment had evolved into something far more significant, both professionally and personally. Michael's phone buzzed with a message from Dean Phillips, meeting with university president at 2 p.m. Bring the full unedited video and any additional observations about Marcus. This could be the catalyst we need. He set his phone down thoughtfully. Since Marcus's mathematical breakthrough, Dean Phillips had been leveraging the situation to push for institutional changes she had advocated for years: expanded outreach to underserved communities, revised admissions criteria that recognized non-traditional expressions of academic excellence, and increased support for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. But there was another aspect to this situation that continued to trouble Michael. As a graduate student who had worked closely with Professor Whitmore for 2 years, he had access to departmental records, including the detailed files the professor kept on promising mathematical talents across the country. Whitmore's meticulous nature extended to cataloging potential future students years before they might apply to Harvard. After witnessing Marcus's incredible abilities, Michael had searched these records, curious whether the professor had ever encountered another prodigy of similar caliber. What he found disturbed him deeply. An hour before his meeting with Dean Phillips, Michael knocked on the door of the university in room where Marcus and his mother were staying. They had extended their visit at Harvard's expense while discussions about Marcus's educational future continued. Amara opened the door, looking more rested than she had in previous days. "Michael," she greeted him warmly. "Marcus is just finishing a video call with Mrs. Taylor. His classmates sent him a congratulations card." Michael smiled. "That's great. I was hoping to speak with both of you about something I've discovered. It might be important for the discussions about Marcus's future." Once invited in, Michael found Marcus sitting cross-legged on a cushion on the floor, a laptop balanced on a stack of books before him. The boy's face lit up at the sight of the graduate student who had become something of a friend over the past few days. "Michael, I was just telling my class about the math library here. Did you know my school library only has 3 books on calculus? Harvard has thousands." "It is pretty amazing," Michael agreed, sitting down across from Marcus. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Marcus replied. "Mom found a doctor here who gave me some new exercises for my back. And I don't have to sit in those hard chairs anymore." After a few minutes of casual conversation, Michael's expression grew more serious. "I wanted to talk to you both about something I found in the department's records. It involves other students like Marcus." Amara sat down beside her son, her nurse's intuition sensing that whatever Michael had discovered was significant. "What kind of records?" Michael took a deep breath. "Professor Whitmore keeps extensive files on mathematically gifted students from across the country. It's ostensibly for recruitment purposes, identifying talent early. But what I found, it's troubling." He opened his laptop and pulled up a spreadsheet. Over the past 15 years, the department has identified 43 students showing exceptional mathematical ability before the age of 12. These students were flagged for potential recruitment, mentorship, special summer programs, and so on. "Okay," Amara said cautiously. "That sounds reasonable for a university looking for talent." "It does," Michael agreed. "Until you look at the pattern of who actually received those opportunities." He turned the screen toward them. Of the 43 identified prodigies, only 11 were invited to participate in Harvard's programs. Of those 11, all came from affluent backgrounds. All but one attended private or elite public schools. And none, not one, was black. Amara's expression hardened. "Are you saying they deliberately excluded children based on race?" "Not explicitly," Michael clarified. "The stated reasons vary: insufficient academic foundation, unconventional learning style, concerns about social integration. But the pattern is unmistakable. Students like Marcus, brilliant but from less privileged backgrounds, were identified but then passed over." Marcus looked up from the spreadsheet, his young face troubled. "There are other kids like me who didn't get a chance." The simple question, delivered with a child's directness, cut to the heart of the matter. "Yes," Michael confirmed gently. "Kids with amazing mathematical gifts who never got the opportunity to develop them at a place like Harvard." Amara's protective instincts flared. "Why are you telling us this now? Is this supposed to make us feel grateful that Marcus is being considered after yesterday's events forced their hand? Michael shook his head. No, Dr. Johnson. I'm telling you because Dean Phillips has a meeting with the university president in an hour, and she's using Marcus's case to push for systemic change. But she doesn't know about this data yet. With your permission, I'd like to present it at the meeting. You could lose your position, Amara observed. Whitmore is your advisor. Michael's smile was tinged with sadness. Some things are more important than career advancement. I've watched Marcus these past few days, his joy in mathematics, his intuitive understanding of concepts that took me years to grasp. How many other children like him have been overlooked because they didn't fit someone's preconception of what a mathematical genius looks like? After a moment of consideration, Amara nodded. Show them. But I want to be in that meeting too. Not just as Marcus's mother, but as someone who's navigated institutional barriers my entire career. Me too, Marcus added quietly. It's about kids like me, right? Shouldn't I get to talk too? Michael and Amara exchanged glances, both surprised and impressed by the boy's request. It would be unprecedented to have a child in such a high-level administrative meeting, but then again, everything about this situation had broken precedent from the beginning. I'll call Dean Phillips, Michael said, reaching for his phone. But I think she'll agree. You've earned the right to be heard, Marcus. 2 hours later, in the ornate conference room of the university president's office, an extraordinary meeting was underway. President Harrington, a distinguished economist with silver hair and a reputation for pragmatism, sat at the head of the table. Dean Phillips was to his right, Professor Whitmore to his left, looking uncommonly subdued. Michael, Amara, and Marcus completed the small circle. Michael had just finished presenting his findings, the damning spreadsheet now displayed on the room's projection screen. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. These are serious allegations, Mr. Chen, President Harrington said finally. Essentially, you're suggesting a pattern of discriminatory practices in one of our most prestigious departments. The data speaks for itself, sir, Michael replied steadily. This isn't about individual intent. It's about systemic outcomes. All eyes turned to Professor Whitmore, whose complexion had grown increasingly pale during Michael's presentation. When he spoke, his voice lacked its usual certainty. I never thought of it in these terms, he said slowly. Each decision was made based on what I believed were sound academic considerations. The road to exclusion is often paved with seemingly neutral criteria, Dean Phillips observed, her tone gentle but unyielding. Richard, you've spent your career identifying mathematical talent. Yet somehow, that talent seems to be concentrated in communities that look and sound like yours. Or perhaps, Amara suggested, her voice clear and steady, the talent is everywhere, but the recognition is not. Marcus, who had been listening intently to the adult conversation, suddenly straightened in his chair. May I say something, please? President Harrington looked surprised but nodded. Of course, young man. I think I understand what happened, Marcus said, his young voice somehow filling the imposing room. When you only look for one kind of smart, you miss all the other kinds. It's like only searching for diamonds when there might be rubies and emeralds too. The simple wisdom of his analogy brought a momentary hush to the room. Then Dean Phillips smiled. Out of the mouths of babes, she said softly. Or in this case, out of the mouth of perhaps the most extraordinary mathematical mind we've encountered in a generation. President Harrington studied Marcus for a long moment, then turned to Professor Whitmore. Richard, you've spent 40 years building Harvard's mathematics program. What do you have to say about all this? The professor looked around the table, his gaze finally settling on Marcus. I was wrong, he said simply. Not just about Marcus, but about how I've conceptualized mathematical talent throughout my career. I've been operating under assumptions that I never properly examined, assumptions about where genius comes from, how it develops, and what it looks like. He turned to Amara. Dr. Johnson, when I saw your son solve that problem yesterday, it challenged everything I thought I knew about mathematical education. And when I learned about his injury, about why he stands instead of sits, it forced me to confront my own reflexive judgments. "Words are easy, Professor," Amara replied, not unkindly but firmly. "What matters now is action." President Harrington nodded in agreement. "Indeed. This situation calls for more than acknowledgement, it demands concrete change." He looked thoughtfully at Marcus. "Young man, you've unknowingly initiated what could be a significant transformation in how this institution identifies and nurtures talent. The question is, where do we go from here?" 6 months after the day Marcus raised his hand in a Harvard lecture hall, the landscape of educational opportunity had begun to shift, first at Harvard, then rippling outward to other institutions across the country. The Marcus Johnson Initiative for Mathematical Excellence, established with initial funding from Harvard and several private foundations, had launched with a clear mission, to identify and support exceptional mathematical talent in underserved communities. Professor Whitmore, in a move that surprised many of his colleagues, had stepped down as department chair to serve as the initiative's first director. On a bright spring afternoon, Marcus stood in the mathematics building's largest lecture hall, the same room where he had solved the impossible problem half a year earlier. But today, he wasn't alone. 25 children from diverse backgrounds filled the front rows, their faces showing varying degrees of excitement and nervousness. "I can't believe we're actually at Harvard," whispered a girl seated near Marcus. Like him, she was standing rather than sitting, though for different reasons. Her ADHD made sitting still for long periods nearly impossible. "It's pretty cool," Marcus agreed. "Wait until you see the library." At the front of the room, Professor Whitmore cleared his throat, bringing the excited chatter to a hush. Beside him stood Dean Phillips, Michael Chen, now the initiative's associate director, and Amara Johnson, who had been hired as the program's student wellness coordinator. "Welcome to the first summer session of the Mathematical Excellence Initiative," Professor Whitmore began, his demeanor noticeably warmer than it had been 6 months ago. "Each of you is here because you've demonstrated extraordinary mathematical ability that deserves to be nurtured and developed." He paused, his eyes finding Marcus in the group. "I learned an important lesson last year from a young mathematician who had the courage to raise his hand when everyone else stayed silent. I learned that brilliance doesn't follow our preconceptions about where it should be found or how it should present itself." The professor gestured to the room around them. "This program is designed to meet you where you are, not where traditional educational models might expect you to be. Some of you learn best while moving. Others need complete quiet. Some process information visually, others verbally or kinesthetically." Michael stepped forward. "The most important thing to remember is that there's no single, right way to be a mathematician. What matters is your unique way of seeing and understanding the world through numbers, patterns, and relationships." As the orientation continued, Marcus felt a gentle touch on his shoulder. His mother had stepped beside him. "How are you feeling?" Amara asked quietly. "Good," Marcus replied with a smile. "My back hardly hurts at all anymore." The physical therapy program recommended by Harvard Medical Center had worked wonders over the past months. While Marcus would likely always have some discomfort after prolonged sitting, the debilitating pain had subsided significantly. But the healing went beyond the physical. In the initiative's learning spaces, designed with input from educational specialists and the students themselves, no one questioned why some children stood, or sat on balance balls, or needed noise-canceling headphones. Accommodation wasn't an afterthought or a reluctant concession, it was built into the foundation of the program. After the orientation, as the students were being shown to their specially designed learning spaces, Professor Whitmore approached Marcus and Amara. "I wanted to thank you both again," he said, the formality that had once defined his manner now softened by genuine humility. "What began as a rather embarrassing moment for me has become the most meaningful work of my career." "It wasn't just us," Marcus pointed out. "Michael found those records. And Dean Phillips pushed for changes." "True," the professor acknowledged with a smile. "But it was your raised hand that started it all." Later that evening, at a small celebration marking the initiative's official launch, President Harrington gave a brief speech to the assembled faculty, students, and supporters. "Institutions change slowly," he concluded, "and often reluctantly. But sometimes, a single moment, a single individual, can catalyze transformation that might otherwise take decades. In raising his hand that day, young Marcus Johnson didn't just solve a mathematical problem, he challenged us to solve the much more complex problem of how we recognize and nurture human potential. As applause filled the room, Marcus stood beside his mother, still somewhat overwhelmed by the attention but increasingly comfortable with his role in the changes taking place. Mrs. Taylor, who had flown in for the event, beamed with pride from the front row. The greatest transformation, however, wasn't visible in the new programs or policies. It lived in the shifted perspectives of people like Professor Whitmore, who now mentored students he might once have dismissed. It flourished in the confidence of children who, for the first time, saw their differences recognized not as deficits but as dimensions of their brilliance. And it continued to grow in Marcus himself, who no longer stood alone at the back of the room, but as part of a community that valued both his extraordinary mind and his ordinary humanity, his right to learn without pain, to be respected without proving his worth, to simply be a child with a gift rather than a prodigy with a burden. As the celebration wound down and guests began to depart, Marcus found himself standing next to Professor Whitmore near a display of the initiative's planned curriculum. "You know," the professor said thoughtfully, "I've been teaching mathematics for 4 decades, but I think I've learned more in these past 6 months than in all those years combined." "About math?" Marcus asked. "About people," Whitmore replied. "And about the assumptions we make without even realizing we're making them." "Do you regret that I raised my hand that day?" Marcus asked, the question that had lingered in his mind finally finding voice. The professor considered this for a moment, then shook his head. "Quite the opposite. It may have been uncomfortable at the time, but necessary discomfort often precedes growth." He smiled at the boy who had challenged his worldview. "Some lessons can only be learned when someone brave enough to stand raises their hand." Dear friend, this story reminds us that brilliance exists everywhere, in every community, in every child, regardless of their race, background, or circumstances. Too often, society fails to recognize talent that doesn't fit our preconceived notions of what genius looks like or where it comes from. The greatest minds may be sitting, or standing, in classrooms right now, their potential overlooked because of prejudice, lack of resources, or physical limitations that aren't properly accommodated. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel, where we continue to share powerful narratives that challenge assumptions and celebrate overlooked brilliance. Together, we can help create a world where every Marcus Johnson gets the chance to raise their hand and change the world.